Now we have another perspective from off-island, from Alaska to the Asia Pacific. For those of you who haven't seen enough of me, I'm Heather Clancy, the editorial director of GreenBiz. And what we're going to do for the next 25 minutes or so is discuss some of the projects that are going on in Australia and South Korea that might have application here on island, what we can learn from other places, what we can learn from the models of those markets. Great group of representatives for our discussion this morning. We have Adam Bumpus. He is the Senior Research Fellow for Environment and Innovation with the University of Melbourne. I hope I said that right. Kind of right. Brian Spack, he is the leader of Grid and Renewables Integration at CSIRO, which I am told is like it's like mashup of NREL, NASA, and Rocky Mountain Institute. And you'll tell us a little bit more about that in a moment. And we also have John Lee. He is the General Manager and Chief Marketing Officer for Encord, which is a Internet of Things company. They specialize in energy data and analytics, and they're doing some really cool projects in various places. John is from California, because the company has California and South Korean presence. So welcome today to this discussion. I want to start with Adam, and we're going to hit a couple of different topics here and then go to the sidebar in a moment. But when you talk about, like when I think about Australia, one of the things that I've learned very recently is just how amazingly deregulated it is, right? And how, and with perfect relevance for what's going on in Hawaii, how much performance matters, how much what the utilities are able to do with the developers and the constituents in any kind of energy project, what they have to pull off and the metrics they have to meet and so forth. So what I wanted you to do is just kind of tease out a couple of the projects that you feel would be most relevant for the Hawaiian market. So things that you've seen in Australia because of that performance-based mindset that could apply here on island.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, Australia's really interesting. We've got 70 plus retailers on the consumer side. 70. So there's so much choice that consumers can make. And at a recent event with one of the CEOs of the CEO of one of the major retailers, his point to us was every day we have to go out and win customers. So that's the context they're working in. And so we also have a churn rate of around 25% or so, which is okay, but it's still, you know, they want to maintain that. But the churn rate happens, those are kind of similar customers because still of all those 70 plus retailers, the top 3 still own 80% of the market. So there's a kind of weird kind of interaction between all these retailers and these kind of ones that kind of pull together.
Cooperatives in that marketplace?
There are some cooperatives, yeah, that are emerging, and there's community-based solar, there's some community-based financing that's happening as well. So there's lots of that, and you can sell back into the grid, and that's kind of where the interesting projects are happening, actually, because there's some really interesting companies that are trying to bring it back to the consumer. And so one company is called PowerShop, which is using an app to try and make it more accessible to people to look at their energy bill, even though, on average, and historically, the average Australian looks at their energy bill for 2 minutes, 45 seconds per year. Wow. Okay.
And you know that, though.
You know, exactly, like, because they're not engaged with it, even though it's costing them a lot of money. So it's kind of a weird land of contradictions in some ways. But the cool thing about this, you know, they have this app that gets people engaged, but they're also engaged with a company that's doing smart solar, which enables it basically attaches the solar and a battery to a box, which then sells your electricity to the grid at the highest price. So it does all the hustling for you, basically. So now they kind of come up with these models that are enabling people to make demand response changes and incentivized by the retailers they're working with. But this is all to try and get the customers back in the game, trying to keep them sticky and keep them involved. And that's the interesting thing, because actually coming back to what we've heard a lot about at Verge is making it a people problem. It's getting back to people, not just the technology. It's really about how people are making their choices.
So you mentioned one project and a startup. Is that a US startup? Is that an Australian startup?
So they're Australian startups, but there's a US startup that you guys probably know from California called OmConnect. That's doing some really interesting stuff on demand response management. They're exploring what could happen in Australia, but theirs is really cool initiative, because they're putting out cheaper devices than their competitors just on demand response management. And so from an equity point of view, the lower income households are actually using it to reduce their cost of their energy bill. So there's some really interesting dynamics here, which is engaging customers, but also giving them the opportunity and the agency to take control over it for economic savings as well as carbon.
Great, great. So Brian, CSIRO, or if I'm butchering the acronym, I apologize. But you were involved, your organization was involved in one of the earliest virtual power plants in Australia, and you're involved in multiple installations up to this point. So I'd love for perspective on how that model, again, what's going on in Australia with VPPs, and how might that play here in Hawaii?
Sure. So a virtual power plant is a grouped together number of households or businesses, each of which has solar and some controllable devices. Typically a battery is the most frequent one, but the first virtual power station we built in 2008 didn't involve a battery. It just involved controllable air conditioning and water heaters. And really the big outcomes from that original project 10 years ago was the importance of standards. So that's a relatively boring topic, but a really important one. So I understand there are smart inverter standards here that really allow or enable greater penetration of solar on the grid, and so that's a really good thing. You can have those same standards on devices, on water heaters and air conditioners that also, by controlling those devices smartly and not in a way that really inconveniences the customer at all, you can allow for much greater penetrations of renewables while avoiding batteries. But fast forward 10 years to today, the economics, as the costs of solar and storage have continued to drop, the economics for customers to just use those devices to reduce their own bill has become pretty overwhelming in Australia, and those economics can be made even better by bidding those back into the grid at certain times. And so things are now going pretty crazy. There have been a number of, we've been involved in a number of 100 household pilots and then 1,000 household pilots. But then just a few months ago, Tesla in South Australia announced 50,000 virtual power plants. Half of those homes will be low-income homes or on public housing. And so these are huge opportunities for all customers.
So just go back to that comment. What happened to allow that participation? Like, what was it? Just because Tesla went in and donated the money to be able to pull those in? How did that happen? What was the model that helped enable that inclusion?
Yeah. So to be clear, it's the goal is to get to 50,000 customers. They're at 100 today or something. But so the market conditions are a little bit different in Australia, in which the state governments have responsibility around reliability. So the state government in South Australia paid not all of the money, but some of the money to get that program going. And one of the conditions they placed upon Tesla was that you have to do the first 25,000 at public housing, and then after you get those 25,000, then you can go to the rest of the market. But it was really a sort of a pay-to-play type of model that we'd like you to do this, but if you're going to do it, you need to look after folks that are going to have a harder time financing.
Great. Okay. Now, John, your company, I would love for you to just tell us a teeny bit more about it, exactly where you play. But you have a project, some projects in South Korea, and you're bringing some technology over to Hawaii. So give us a sense of what's going on in Korea that could apply here in Hawaii.
All right. So in South Korea, I think South Korea and Hawaii is relatively some similar situations. We are countries scarce of finite resources like fossil fuels. It is almost entirely depends on the import. So we are 9% of oil, our energy from the import, it depends on the import. We are the country, the 5th largest oil importer in the world. So we are, in South Korea, we already, really the air pollution is a really big issue, and President Moon's government released last December the renewable energy 3020. It declares we should be increased the energy mix share its current level of 7% to 20% by 2030. So we have a lot of the project, but we have one big project in South Korea, in Seoul National University campus, micro campus grid. So there, in Seoul National University is one top of university in South Korea. They have a 200 building entire campus, and Encore technologies and ESS and PV we installed on the campus, 60 buildings out of the 200. The aim of this microgrid project is to reduce the 20% of energy reduction. So 10% of Encore energy saving technology, the other 10% is from the renewable.
Okay. And you're bringing that technology to Hawaii?
Yes. Actually, it was funded from the Korean government, from the KIPTEP. It's a KTP, it's Korean Institute of Energy Technology Evaluation and Planning. So it's funded from the Korean government. We are just work with, it's the same concept of microgrid in Seoul campus. We are the consortium members from the Seoul National University professors and Mark from Hawaii. And we are the target site is two of target site is the Nerha in the big island of Hawaii. We just installed, we just implement 1 megawatt, the microgrid. It's a 0.5 megawatt EPV and 0.5 megawatt ESS. So they just want to their independent operation. And the other side is gonna be North Hawaiian Community Hospital. You know that it's really important the power supply is directly the patient's life in the hospital. So it's both the project, we just, their aims, their purposes are some peak reduction around some 120 kilowatt per annually in $14,000, and also reduction of the greenhouse gases.
Right. Data is obviously you're a big data company, and what you're doing, or what you've seen and what we see in Australia, it very much relies on that information flow and the data being available and open. So I'm going to throw this out to both of you, but starting with Adam, it's just the role of smart meters in that. And you know, smart meters have kind of been like waxing and waning here in the US. I'm not sure about here on island, actually, but you know, it's kind of a topic fraught with controversy. But how important are they in what's going on?
Yeah, it is a topic fraught with controversy. So I live in a state called Victoria, which is in the southern part of Australia. And in 2006, the government decided to roll out smart meters for everybody. So everyone got a smart meter at a cost of $2.2 billion. And that was like a national mandate? That was, no, state mandate. State mandate.
I'm sorry.
Our
yes,
state, yeah, state. Just the state. So everyone got a smart meter, and this was highly controversial because of the amount of money that was involved, but also it's become increasingly controversial over time because the data hasn't been used. So we've got all these smart meters, and there's virtually no access to the data. And when you talk to someone, you say, well, you know, you've got a smart meter, you can understand exactly what your energy use is at any time. They're like, fair income, really? I can understand everything about my energy, and no one knows. It's basically a box that no one even thinks about. And the government, when you try and talk to them, we had a meeting with them saying, hey, why don't we sandbox this? Why don't we work out some way to get privacy with the data, but open it up so we can have third-party people work with it? And they're like, aha, okay, that's interesting. But at the same time, people, when you start talking about the data, they're incredibly cynical about what that data is going to be used for. There's a poll that came out about a month ago that said 2/3 of Australians are not happy or are worried about what their data would be used by and do not trust their power companies. That comes below the banking sector. When you know you're trusted less than the banks, you know things are going kind of wrong, right? So this is what is happening right now. There's this massive lack of trust, but there's a massive amount of data that is basically being generated but being held. There's no access to it. So there's no third party. You can pay to get hold of some of that data, but you can't. There's no real innovation happening on the third party access there. So if you're rolling out smart meters, have a plan to use the data is the key bit.
So, so while Victoria sort of has its own unique challenges with smart meters, I was surprised when I came to Australia that there was because outside of Victoria, there's very few smart meters. There's like 10,000 here and there, but by and large, there's no smart meters. And the utility I worked at in the States, we relied on smart meters to do a lot of different things to better understand the grid. And so at CSIRO, so there's another issue where there is plans to roll out additional smart meters, but those are being done by the retailers, not the poles and wires companies, and there's questions about data access. It's a big mess, is the short story. So one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is, do we even need smart meters in the future? And if you really think about it, a primary role of the utility is to keep voltage within a certain range. So it gets pretty heady pretty fast. I'm not an engineer either, don't worry. But smart meters actually aren't particularly helpful to do that. So some smart meters have voltage measurement, but they don't do it that well. And so in the future, because Australia has the greatest solar resource of any country and continent in the world, look out 10 years, energy could be virtually free. And in that instance, do we really need to be measuring kWh anymore? And if we don't need to be measuring kWh, then why the hell are we going to spend all this money on smart meters? So are there alternatives, and are there ways to just really measure voltage at more specific and accurate locations and do some smart data analytics to model the grid in a more cost-effective way?
John, I'd love to hear your perspective on how South Korea handles the data privacy, especially with respect to energy. I mean, how is your information collected? It's devices?
Oh yeah, so we collect actually we take energy data from the smart meter and also get our really small device. So right now in South Korea, we almost don't have a smart meter infrastructure in South Korea. So in US, we got the access from the green button, from the PG&E and the CS, to some third party, we just provide the service from the smart meter data. But in South Korea, we have so right now, nowadays we have some little bit issue because all our platform is cloud in South Korea. So we should have some service in the US. They just all their energy data should go to the South Korea part. So right now, there's some issues. We should move our cloud to the US right now.
I have two more questions, but I would like to take one from the audience via sidebar. If Elaine, you have something queued up for us, we'd love to take it on the panel.
Yeah.
There you are.
Hi.
Hi.
Wizard of Oz. What is Hawaii doing right? So what lessons are you learning from Hawaii or other parts of the US or even the world as your respective countries of business transition to more clean energy systems?
Anyone can take that?
I think the one thing that Hawaii is doing right in terms of what we heard here at Verge is the real focus on who are you serving, and the focus on equity and the focus on community. Because one of the challenges that we have in Australia is that it's so competitive, it's so challenging in the market that people are forgetting, really what they're producing and who they're working with in terms of their consumers. They're going out to win consumers, but they're very happy once they've won them to not provide that service over time. And so so when we're talking about here, that kind of community part is really important. But the other part is that we've got, at the federal level, we've got the consumer data right happening, which means that consumers own their data. That's the law going through this year. And so there's some interesting parallels that we can pull through and back and forth between Hawaii and Australia in terms of when we've got these new systems going out and you've got a lot of community-based electricity on Kauai here, that kind of work is really interesting because it's about, okay, who's owning the data, who has the right to the data, and we can learn a lot from Hawaii in terms of how to pull those things together and do that on a community basis that is scalable as well. I'm not talking about tiny little community, it's just isolated community activities. I'm talking about the community of the citizenship that we have as a country.
Yeah, and I'd say two things. So one, I think the HECO's grid modernization plan is actually really innovative and that leading edge globally for how all utilities, it's a boring business. What they're really good at is planning. And that approach to planning is wholly unique. It's where everybody else is going to move. Australia is trying to move there. It's a much bigger market, so it's a little bit more challenging. But what HECO has done there is truly sort of evolutionary and best practice. That's one thing. The other thing, and this is sort of just an expat recognition, civil society throughout the U.S. and in Hawaii is such a huge asset in multiple ways. So civil society, NGOs, you know, nonprofits that push the government and push HECO and companies to do better, to do more, play a huge role in the debate here in a way that's pretty unique to the rest of the world. And that's especially true in Hawaii, and so I think that's something that all democracies could learn from.
Mm-hmm. John, do you have anything to add? No? Okay. One thing that I've also noticed from the Australian market is the right, so there's you hear about blockchain a lot being used in Australia. I'm not sure about South Korea, but what, is it hyped? Is it real? Is it, you know, I know there's a number of projects going on, including some from US startups actually. But so tell us the role of blockchain in the Australian market and how real it's becoming.
Well, we're in Honolulu, and so I guess blockchain's a bit like Elvis. It's not going to die ever, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So because it is very present. There's a ton of hype. Like there's the whole thing is that there's a blockchain solution for absolutely everything, and that's just not true. And it's hyped because it's been hyped through the cryptocurrency markets and all that kind of stuff that happens when something gets into the early stage later adopters. So that's the hyper side. There are some really interesting projects happening actually with US companies. So LO3 from Brooklyn is just opening a project in the place where we have our biggest coal-fired power stations in Victoria, which are shutting down. They're opening a project there, which is with the dairy industry. So they're basically using blockchain to trade energy across the dairy industry and create a virtual power plant there. So there's some interesting work happening like that. And I think for what we see in the blockchain space is that it isn't just so isolated. I mean, we got some specific use cases in countries, but it's actually opening up the world because you're able to transact value and understand what that value really means across geographical distributions as well. So the blockchain will live, it will have use, and it's going to be a bit of a game changer in certain places and not in others.
I hope it looks like young Elvis, not older Elvis, but Brian?
Elvis like 73 when he came here and did the Aloha.
Brian, anything to add?
Well, yeah, so blockchain is in use in Australia, and that project, there's an Australian-based startup, Power Ledger, in Western Australia doing some pretty innovative stuff with solar on apartment buildings. I think but the other important thing to understand about Australia is that all of this stuff is happening now, and all of this stuff being virtual power plants and distributed energy and a whole new approach to the grid. And by and large, blockchain has nothing to do with it. So I think for me, the jury's still a little bit out on when blockchain will really be a catalyst for change, but there seems to be lots of potential there.
John, we have a couple seconds for any final words on blockchain in South Korea. Any thoughts on it?
Did you heard of the kimchi premium? Last year, Korea is the hottest country of the Bitcoin. So right now, we have a not real, but Samsung SDS, they have their own platform. We just have some blockchain-related energy peer-to-peer trading. We have 2 apartments in Seoul City and 9 buildings related to Capco buildings. They are doing some proof of concept for the blockchain trading.
Well, we're out of time. I would love to thank our panel. Thank you for your insights and inspiration. Please, mahalo.